All Saints, sort of like Ash Wednesday in the spring, All Saints is a weird holiday because it seems like we do everything we can in modern life and in this world to avoid talking about, looking at, acknowledging the reality of death. And we come here on All Saints and we almost revel in it. In the reality that each one of us carries with us the names of people who have gone before, whom we continue to grieve in a variety of ways. I'm thinking this All Saints of the first funeral that I ever went to. It was my grandmother, Ethel. It's a family name that did not live on after her. And I was in kindergarten. I was 5 years old when I went to my first funeral, that I remember anyway. And I remember being at the funeral home, and it was a traditional small-town funeral where everybody came out to the funeral home, and Grandma was laid out in the open casket, and I was 5. And I remember saying to my parents, I want to get out of here. This is creepy. And so they took me back to Grandma's house just down the street. And I spent the next several hours at home, 5 years old. We just don't do things the same anymore. All by myself in Grandma's house at 5 years old, watching out the window, waiting for them to come home because death is creepy and uncomfortable. I have since attended dozens of deaths as that person passes and hundreds of funerals. In some ways, death is still creepy, but I have found in the midst of that a real beauty that we don't get to experience because we avoid death. For most of us, death happens when our loved one is in the hospital, behind closed doors. Often they're accompanied by medical professionals, as opposed to 100 years ago when 95% of deaths happened in the home, surrounded by their families. A lot has changed. And because a lot has changed, and it's good, because it means that we're getting medical care. Don't mishear me, right? Right? It means that we're living longer because we're in the hospitals, because we're getting that medical care. But it means that we are further removed from death when death happens. We are further removed from seeing that reality, and so we find ourselves able to fool ourselves into thinking that death is something far away. Death is something that doesn't affect us. Death is something that we can ignore and not talk about it. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. Think about reading the obituaries and how far out of their way people go to not say the word dead. He passed on. She went to be asleep with the Lord. Went to be with the Lord. She's no longer with us. She went home, went to heaven, asleep in the Lord. Man, I grew up in the generation where we talked about people asleep when they're dead. That's creepy. Because dead people don't wake up. They're not asleep. It's like Voldemort, right? Like it's he who shall not be named. We do everything we can to not say dead. You know, there's nothing wrong with the word. And in not saying the word, we're avoiding the reality of facing the truth. In John 11, we get this great story that occurs only in John, where Jesus shows up at his best friend's house. Everything we know about Jesus seems to be that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were the people closest to Jesus, right? When Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he sleeps on Lazarus' couch, right? He's the friend that Jesus can show up in town and just show up at the front door without saying, I'm coming. Do you have a friend like that? Right? Someone who you can call at 2 in the morning and you know that they'll pick up. Someone who you can ask to borrow their car and they'll just hand you the keys and say, sure. That's Jesus and Lazarus. And Jesus shows up, and Mary and Martha are doing what a lot of us do when we grieve. They're ticked off. Jesus, if you had been here, you who already has raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, you who healed the blind man, Lazarus would still be alive if you had gotten off your rear and gotten here more quickly. Grief often comes with anger. It's a part of it. I love that it includes that in the scriptural story. So we know that we aren't alone when we experience that. Everyone who has experienced grief has experienced the anger that comes with it. And Lazarus, or Jesus rather, is there, comes to Lazarus' tomb, and we get every confirmation student's favorite verse to choose as their memory verse. Jesus wept. Y'all, look. If anybody knew that Jesus had the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, don't you think it was Jesus? Don't you think if anybody knew that it was all going to turn out all right, it was Jesus? If anybody in the history of the world knew that God had a plan, it was Jesus. And Jesus wept. We love to throw at death all of these, I hope you feel better because I'm uncomfortable with the fact that you're sad sayings. It's going to be okay. God has a plan. They're in heaven. They're with Jesus. Jesus knew all that. And all that is true, but not helpful. Right? It can be true and still not be helpful. Jesus knew all of that. Jesus knew that he had the power over life and death, and Jesus still wept. And I say that because I don't think we hear enough. I don't think you've heard enough. Grief is holy. Grief is holy. Jesus grieved. Nobody in the history of the world had a better sense of God's ultimate victory than Jesus Christ. And Jesus wept. The psalmist, as Leanne read for us, said, "You turn my mourning into dancing." Doesn't say, "I'll never grieve again." The psalmist doesn't say in Psalm 23, "I never have to walk through the valley of the shadow of the death." It says, "When I walk through," not even if, "when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me." You cannot live in this world, you cannot exist as a human being without being touched by death. No matter how much we try and ignore it and put it aside and hide it, you cannot live in this world without being touched by death. And the reason that we gather on All Saints and Ash Wednesday and other days and funerals and we talk about the reality of death is because we know even when we are grieving that death is not the last word. For if, says St. Paul, for if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. On All Saints we gather and we celebrate not that death happens, But we celebrate that death is not the end, that once we have acknowledged death, we can begin to talk about the power of resurrection. Once we have talked about the reality that we grieve, we are sad about the loss of our loved ones, we can celebrate that they surround us through the power of Jesus Christ still this day. That this space is full, that it is not just a worship of you and I, but it is a worship of you and I and all of them with us this day, singing with us, praying with us, rejoicing with us. Once we have acknowledged the reality of death, we can also acknowledge that death holds no power over us because we are resurrection people. So we grieve, and with Jesus we weep, and with Mary and Martha we rage, and also we sing, and we rejoice, and we praise.